Charles University in Prague since 2001, guest conducted in Europe and the United States, and worked on a number of acclaimed opera productions. He is a senior deacon of the Armenian Church and a pupil of Archbishop Zare Asnorian of blessed memory, with research interests in the musicology, theology, and iconography of the Armenian Hymnal and in the works of Saint Gregory of Narek. He has published the volumes They Who Imbibe the Effusions of the Spirit, The Art of the Armenian Books Through the Ages, which came out in 2016, and Treasures of the Earliest Christian Nation, Spirituality, Art, and Music in Medieval Armenian Manuscripts. This came out 2 years later, as well as Tntesean and the Music of the Armenian Hymnal, also 2018, and a critical edition of Dvořák's Mass in D, which came out in Bayernreiter in 2020. Haig Utidjian was recently decorated with the Komitas Medal by the Armenian state, the Jakob Metaport Medal by the National Library of Armenia, and the Medal of the Pan-Armenian Cultural Union. So we are thrilled that he is with us today, and we look forward to hearing his lecture. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Carmen, for the very kind, Carmel, for the very kind introduction. Let me just share my screen. And ascertain that you are indeed able to see my screen and continue to hear me loud and clear.
Wonderful.
Splendid.
Yep.
Well, thank you very much indeed for this delightful opportunity, which is a pleasure as well as an honor. I should like briefly to outline what I'm going to say. I will start with a very brief introduction to the problem of the Armenian neumes, the medieval musical notation, which we are unable to decipher today, refer to various sources of Armenian theory and put Tntesean in the context of those, and take us thereby to the milieu of 19th century Armenian Constantinople, where there was dissatisfaction with the neumes, which could no longer be understood properly, concern about the loss of a corpus of melodies that was believed to have passed on over the centuries through oral tradition, and the use of the neumes, such as they were, as well as Western influences at the time. So there was a desire to give fixity to the melodies. And in this connection, I will refer to the theoretical work of Tntesean. He made many contributions, but what interests me is the procedures that he advocated be used in order to make use of the medieval neumes in constructing melodies, albeit that use could only be limited because the neumes could only be partially understood. I will then reach certain interesting conclusions by comparing some of his redactions and transcriptions with his professed principles, and we shall notice that there are occasions when he deviates from his own professed principles. But it is not enough to say that he deviates. It would be very interesting and instructive to see in what way he deviates, why, and what the motivation may be behind that. And I will conclude by briefly mentioning the reception that his work was accorded both during his lifetime, which was cut short at the age of 47, and subsequently to the present day. So, something about the Armenian neumes. We do not know where they came from. There are different hypotheses, nor do we know what their vintage is. I have seen a source that is probably from the 11th century, which does have some Armenian neumes, but it is very, very rare. Most of our sources are from the 13th, 14th centuries, with some examples from the very late 13th century. And music notated in this manner can be found in a variety of codices from different genres, hymnals, books of odes, and other liturgical. Nor do we understand when exactly the neumes could no longer be understood. It was probably a gradual thing rather than an abrupt change. We know for a fact that scribes and even printers from the mid-17th century onwards, in the case of the first printed Armenian hymnal, for example, conservatively reproduced the numations, perhaps even uncomprehendingly. What certainly happened in medieval times is that the numations were copied out faithfully, but in all likelihood, each generation of singer and church musician wished to give vent to their own creativity in accordance with the tastes of their own time. So probably the melodies developed and a distance, a chasm was created between the notation that they had in front of them and what they actually sang. The melodies may have evolved in their modality as well, and probably they increased in their degree of melismaticity. And all these things made the connection between the neumes and the melodies tenuous. Unlike the Middle Byzantine notation, we don't have the good fortune of having any manuals, such as the Byzantine Fatike, that would explain the system to us. And to all this, we must add all manner of catastrophes, relocations, destruction, discontinuities in transmission that may have damaged knowledge of the system. Now, the first two illustrations on this slide are tables of Armenian neumes published by Tntesean himself, the hero of the day, whilst on the right-hand side is a list that I have reproduced from the standard printed hymnals. This list has not changed very much over the last centuries, that are deployed in the Armenian canonical hymnal. What made the beginning of the 19th century particularly interesting, of course, is that a new notational system was invented in Constantinople around the year 1812, more or less at the same time as the Greeks revised their own pneumatic system. The Byzantine system emerged. These things happened in parallel, albeit probably independently, because the systems are very different. But the new Armenian system, which you can see in the middle of this slide, though it borrowed the shapes of 7 of the medieval neumes, it operates in a completely different way. It's like a tonic solfa notation system, or for those who are familiar with it, the Greek lesbian system, invented by Georgios Lesbios, whereby each symbol corresponds to a particular note, it has its own pitch, and there's a system of dots and signs that show the rhythm. So the emergence of this new system in the beginning of 19th century paradoxically resulted in renewed interest in the medieval neumes, because church musicians were for the first time confronted with the challenge of writing down in a fixed way, and moreover in a way that could be read and inspected and assessed and criticized, but also sung by others. A large corpus of about 1,500 hymnal melodies. And in order to do so, they went back to the medieval neumes, which, however, they could not properly understand. Tntesean was at the forefront of this, and he managed to make observations about the medieval neumes and detective work, which is very, very exciting and which is still useful as a guide to our own day. Work that certainly has not been surpassed, and work which provided him with a justification of certain procedures which he used in an attempt to realize melodies. And I hesitate about which word to use, because they're not mere transcription. They are heavily redacted melodies. They are constructed melodies. I don't want to call them manufactured melodies, but in a sense, a very, very rough analogy would be to say that by the same token whereby if we are given a figured bass, we're able to play something at the harpsichord. Maybe that can give you a slight inkling of the kind of work that Tntesean was endeavoring to do. And what is interesting is that others seem to have made use of those procedures, but without making the fact explicit. Tntesean was the only one who honestly described his procedures. And as is often the case, in describing his procedures, he did not mention certain things that were probably obvious to his time, but are not obvious to us. And I will try to look between the lines, as it were, to try and show what he did. I said I would put all this in context, so sources of Armenian music theory can be taken back, well, at least to the late 14th century with the Book of Questions by St. Gregory of Datev, but that is mostly about mythical origins of the eight-modal system, the Octoikos. There's an anonymous Boskeporik found in Venice, probably from the 16th or 17th centuries. It does refer to the neumes, but it's more concerned about the playing techniques of a stringed instrument of some sort. Fachatur Erzumetsi Arakelian is another interesting source. He has a chapter on music written in verse, and his verses incorporate the neumes, but without shedding any useful light about how the neumes might have been used. Next comes Joachim Schroeder, who has a chapter on Armenian sacred music, and he lists the neumes, but he doesn't know how they're used. This is the beginning of the 18th century now. And at the end of that same century, the Constantinopolitan church musician Papazakarian produced a number of books where he has rather incomprehensible information about notation, but what he appears to be doing is redefining the old neumes to devise some sort of workable system of notation. In fact, he endeavors to produce various hybrid notations that combine Byzantine neumes with Armenian neumes in ways that are not very clear to us. But it includes the Armenian translation of a Byzantine Papathiki, and he even has some Greek items notated, albeit with Armenian script. Out of interest, you might like to know that the very first occasion when Byzantine neumes were printed using moving type was in fact this Armenian publication, Constantinople 1794. And there were others within his own circle who did similar things. But of course, all this was abandoned when the new Armenian system was defined, invented and presented a few years later, to which I refer. Another person who has done interesting work on the neumes, and perhaps the only useful one up until this point, is the Viennese monk, Father Anton Utkardassian, who has made a lot of interesting observations about contexts where particular neumes appear, which neume follows which other neume in many instances. And it's interesting that now we are trying to devise digital humanities tools to undertake something that is very much in the same spirit as what Utkardassian had. So he is probably the only significant antecedent to Tntesean. Viotto, in his Description de l'Égypte, tried to describe the Armenian neumes, but he was given, not surprisingly, confusing information, and he says, "Mais nous doutons de l'exactitude de cet exemple," because, of course, the examples don't correspond with the ostensible application of the neumes. Another antecedent of Tntesean was the Venetian Father Minas Pezeshkian. His monograph is devoted mostly to an explication of the new Armenian system, and he has a dim view of the usefulness of the medieval neumes. And this is what brings us to Ełia Tntesean, his corpus of writings and transcriptions, mostly between 1862 and 1870. Two other sources that we will have occasion to refer to in this talk are Pietro Bianchini, an Italian musician who was very much steeped in sacred music, particularly as sung in San Lazzaro in Venice. He has letters that are of very great interest in terms of the aesthetics of the music, in terms of performance practice, in terms of underlying theology, and instructions to his singers as to how they should perform the music. And again, to do with aesthetics, there's a very interesting article by Archimandrite Komidas criticizing Yegmalian's arrangement of the chants of the Armenian Divine Liturgy. And rather than focus on the criticisms, to me, much more interesting is the kind of aesthetic manifesto put forward by Komitas. Particularly, there's a sentence that he has written in his ideal version of the melodies of the Divine Liturgy. Verbal and melodic stresses should kiss each other. Something that reminds me of Psalm 85. Mercy and truth are met together. Righteousness and peace have kissed each other. So much for the context surrounding Tntesean himself. Of his own works, the first here, Povantagutiun Nevakats, is a tiny booklet of transcriptions into Western musical notation, intended to demonstrate that the principal features of the Armenian melodies can indeed be reproduced using staff notation. Negarakir Yerkots, which is a compendium of all his musicological articles published up until then, and some new work, which is of very crucial importance, and it will be the focus of this talk. But also he has a book of chants numerated by himself, called Varjutun Tsanavormangans, Exercises for Vocally Endowed Children. This will prove to be of crucial interest later in this talk. Darerki Rajishtujan, Elements of Music. It basically introduces the new notation and does not deal with the neumes. And finally, his own redactions of the melodies of the Armenian Hymnal, which were published posthumously in 1934 and were therefore not available to his immediate successors. There are other materials also. Of particular interest are the minutes of the 48 sessions of the Patriarchal Committee, of which Tntesean was a member, and which have recently been published by my friend and colleague Aram Perovpian, and which still need to be mined properly. In particular, there are two things that are relevant to this talk. His hypothesis regarding durational values of syllables bearing particular neumes or none, which he arrived at on the basis of the Armenian Hymnal. Basically, what he did was he looked at strophic hymns that are of more or less regular meter, and where the verbal text consists of lines that have the same length. And he noticed that here and there were lines that were too short, they were defective, a syllable was missing. And he noticed that in such instances, a different neume had been deployed than was the case in the other stanzas. And he postulated that that different neume may have a duration of 2 beats to make up for the shortfall of 1 syllable and to ensure that that line is sung to the same duration as the other corresponding lines in the same hymn. So this allowed him to postulate that certain neumes were worth 1 beat, 1 metrical unit. Other neumes were long neumes and were worth 2 units. Certain combinations were intended to be dwelt on for 4 beats. But of course, he was not able to do much more for more complicated combinations of neumes. And the other thing that he demonstrated is that if you assume that syllables bearing particular neumes have fixed fixed durational values, even in the case of prose hymns that have lines of irregular length, if you apply his hypothesis, you end up having a piece of music that is in regular meter, usually duple meter. The third basis for his hypothesis was empirical observation. He claims that all around him, he sees that church musicians, when singing whilst gazing upon the medieval neumes, though they do not understand the medieval neume, they sing in a way that respects such metrical durations, apparently bestowed by the neumes on syllables of text which bear them. Now, this is a little dangerous, of course, because it leads one to ask, might there have been a self-fulfilling circularity about this? In other words, could it be that some church musicians had been told that some neumes you should spend 1 beat on, other neumes you should spend 2 beats on, and they adapted their melodies accordingly? Or is this something that flows out of the medieval time and an inherent property of the old neumes? I'm reminded by the work done by Toret Varnölit, published in his book, The Revival of the Byzantine Musical Tradition on Mount Athos, which has a poignant demonstration of the influence of contemporaneous theoretical considerations over traditional practice at the monastery of Patopedi on Mount Athos. Despite claims of continuity and adherence to tradition, the monks were evidently influenced by external developments in scholarship and theoretical thinking, and willingly jettisoned elements of their oral tradition for the sake of what they were told was right, more authentic, more ancient. I'm quoting from my own review of this volume. However, it does appear that Tntesean was right, because rather excitingly, I have been able to corroborate his hypothesis regarding metrical durations on the basis of my own recent work on a different repertoire, on the repertoire of sacred odes, which is a distinct genre from the hymnal, on the basis of which Tntesean had made his observations. These are some illustrations from Tntesean's publication, by the way. So, similar findings seem to accrue by looking at the odes of St. Gregory of Narek, who died in the year 1003, although the manuscript I've used is from 1241, the earliest extant source for any Armenian odes, including those of St. Gregory of Narek. And in the case of one particular ode, we find that in the third source, if you look at these 3 lines, we have 1 syllable missing. I don't know if my arrow is visible. So whereas we have pile pachpin darads there, pile pachpin darads there, 5 syllables and 7 beats according to Tntesean's durational values, if we accept them pro tempore. Here we've got palk idarad, so there's a syllable missing. But whilst above we had this neume and this neume, each of which are of a single beat's duration, here we have this neume, which is of 2 beats duration. Thereby, the missing syllable is compensated for because one sings, whatever one sings, for 2 beats over this syllable, whereas these were 1 beat each. Another example, another ode by St. Gregory of Narek, where though the words look very irregular if you count the numbers of syllables in each line of each stanza, if you give Tntesean's values to the neumes in terms of duration, and they're not the same neumes, they are different neumes, but neumes which have such durations that we get the regular meter pa 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 pum, pi pa pa pum, pi ta 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 pi pa 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 pa, and so on and so forth, which is unlikely to be coincidence. It's not a watertight proof. Now, I want to proceed to a second important contribution by Tntesean, which was also key to his toolbox to construct melodies. And it was the following. He noticed that particular sets of neumes are apt to occur in particular families, species, within a given mode. Species of melodies within each mode were identified from the neumes. In other words, he noticed that there are certain groups of hymns where the same neumes occur, and they tend to recur in groups, either as combinations on particular syllables or as sequences on successive syllables. And in his own words, they constitute a regular system that is strikingly visible. Again, we cannot read the neumes, we don't understand the neumes. He says they cannot show us the real melody, but we can identify the melody species from the arrangement of the neumes alone. And the recurrence of highly telling combinations, sequences of neumes, means that 2/5 of all the items in the hymnal are nemanorinagnir, which literally means similar copies. I would be tempted to use the word contrafacta. But of course, they're not contrafacta in the Western sense, in that the melody is not identical. It's just that there are patches where the same motifs appear, whatever they are. Thus, if you will permit me to use contrafacta for the word, though, with some license, writing the contrafacta for chants of every such melody, one after the other, meant that one melody facilitated the other as if they were all excerpts from the same song, which indeed they are, he says. And I'll demonstrate here the sort of thing that I mean. On the left-hand side is a table of hymns of a particular family, and wherever I've written the letter capital M, you find that there's this combination of neumes. I'm looking for my cursor. Yes. Here, for example, and there, and there, and there, and there, and there, and there, and so on. And generally speaking, Tntesean made a point of deploying the same motif when this combination of neumes occurred. So if in one instance he wrote the melody, then he tried to put it in every other instance where the same combination occurred in hymns of the same family. Examples of sequences of neumes, recognizable sequences. Here, you see, this tends to occur in a number of hymns within the same group of hymns in a particular mode. This is another example. We will return to these examples in a moment in a slightly more critical way, but I want to continue by saying that this implied, as it were, a sort of heuristic for the construction and redaction of melodies. So first of all, scan the numerations vis-a-vis the text to see how melismatic the melody ought to be. That's the most fundamental decision that has to be made. Secondly, by noticing the repertoire of neumes, which neumes appear there, and further noticing particular combinations and sequences, telling combinations, recognizable sequences, recognizable as being familiar from some other familiar item or items, determine what subspecies of melody is appropriate for this item. Next, obtain a melody you already know for a famous hymn that has the same hymns. And the most interesting question is, where did these melodies come from? I will just say for the moment they were floating in the Bosphorus air somewhere. Attempt to tailor that melody over the words of the present hymn, despite the fact that there may be a completely different number of syllables. And you will have these patches of these passages where these neumes occur, where you know what the motif should be, but you have to bridge the gaps in a musically convincing way. Generally speaking, Tntesean said that one should take up any slack at the beginning, and all along, whilst so doing, ensure that the durational values associated with syllables bearing particular neumes or no neumes be respected in accordance with his hypothesis. Now, the interesting thing is that if you start looking in detail at the melodies redacted by other scholars of the same milieu, you find that they appear to be doing more or less the same as Tntesean, assessing the degree of melismaticity, recognizing melody species, identifying characteristic sequences and combinations, and attempting consistently to deploy the same motifs as they recur, and observing perceived metrical durations associated with neumes. There are exceptions, and there are good reasons for the exceptions. I don't have the time to go into them. But the interesting thing is that all this is done in the context of practical musical knowledge of the properties of each mode, as well as the recollection from memory of certain standard melodies and formulaic phrases that served as models. And this way of writing down melodies, constructing melodies, if you will, probably reflects quasi-improvisatory practices during performances in real time, during sacred services, religious services. People would do this, more or less, gazing upon a printed hymnal with the neumes and devising the melody, trying to do so as convincingly as possible. But these procedures had to be systematized from the moment when you need to write down those melodies, whereby it's not just enough to do something in the air of oral actuality for that moment that is convincing and will disappear into the ether. You're writing something down that can be criticized by your colleagues, so you've got to be careful how you're doing it and be more consistent, perhaps. And this is the reason why the neumes continued to be reproduced in printed hymnals throughout this period. They were being used. They were being used in this very limited, very crude way that does not make use of the information that the neumes probably embodied in medieval times, which we do not know, but nonetheless, they helped the musician to sing the melodies. And of course, this leads us to the question, to what extent was Tntesean doing something new, if many of his colleagues were engaged in the same procedures? This is very difficult to ascertain with certainty, but one thing is certain, that Tntesean is the only one who explicitly and honestly described what he was doing, whereas the others, generally speaking, wanted to give the impression that they are singing the melodies that they remember, that were taught by their grandparents, and all this came from the medieval period without any corruption or distortion, etc., with a certain mystique about it. Even to this day, if you see someone in a church reading a hymn or singing a hymn by looking at the neumes, there's an air of wizardry about it. Now, it becomes interesting when we see where Tntesean deviates from his own professed principles. And these are two hymns, A and B, that belong to the same subspecies, the same family. And where you can see after the parentheses, the text bears exactly the same four neumes with a gap over a syllable between the first and the second. So there's one neume, no neume, another neume, that neume, and you find the same. We would expect Tntesean to have deployed the same motif starting from here as he deployed here. That is not the case if we look at his own hymnal. What happens is he deploys the same motif from here over the word taramergial, a four-syllable word, and here, jashagetsin. Why does he do this? He gives precedence to the verbal stresses rather than seek to maintain consistency by starting his melody where the actual chain of neumes starts. You might then ask, why then is there a discrepancy between the verbal stresses of the words taramergial and jashagetsin and the chains of neumes? Well, I have to be very careful about responding to that. I don't know. But one possibility may be that, as distinct from the melodies written and sung in Tntesean's own day, perhaps in medieval times, the melody was much flatter, much more uniform. And so commencing a particular melody in a different part of the word, which may be more stressed in one item and less stressed in another example, would not have mattered so much. I do not know. This is yet another example where Tntesean finds the same neumes in two different cases, but the melody is not the same. It is almost the same, but the melisma found here, sorry, I must stop pointing at my screen, computer screen with my pencil and instead find my cursor. So here, the melody that he has here in this hymn is put there. And the melody that is there in this hymn, he's put there. He's swapped them. why has he done them? I think the answer can be found if we look at the previous bits of the same stanza, which are rather different in the case of the two hymns. One stanza is much longer than the other. And I think that musical context here is what caused him to write a slightly different melody that departed in this way from correspondence with the neumes. And in any case, he could always justify himself by thinking, well, in any case, we don't really know what the neumes mean, what the melodies are. So why sacrifice a nice overall melody for the sake of maintaining consistency with the neumes? Now, one area where I think I shouldn't say criticize, but where we need to be critical about some of the things Tntesean was thinking or writing or doing. And after all, Tntesean was a brilliant and original thinker, but he was not omniscient or infinitely wise. We have already discussed the occasional inconsistencies in positioning motifs associated with recurring combinations or sequences, but there are other things Tntesean could not establish any more than we. The duration values of syllables bearing complex combinations of neumes. He had traditional views about the history and age of the neumes, arguing that later contrafacta, based on much earlier hymns, were evidence that the sacred melodies had remained unchanged over the centuries, whereas in fact we know that replicated numations are no guarantee that the melodies constructed by different generations, variously interpreting the neumes, are necessarily the same. He had charts of oscillations to demonstrate what the Armenian and generally speaking Eastern musical scales ought to be. And I think they are oversimplified and do not seem to account for particular notes being variable in their pitch, depending on their modal context. But what I will now show is one thing. He had a penchant for ensuring that the stanzas of a hymn, particularly strophic hymns, those that have many stanzas with more or less the same meter, be identical, even when the evidence was against this. He seems to have been willing to force the melody into the same mold, even when the neumes militated against this in terms of their durational values. And of course, to some extent, he was justified because the printed hymnals in 19th Constantinople were rife with errors, and so they needed correction. So once you start correcting the medieval neumes, where do you stop? He seems to have taken the liberty of making such corrections even to the numations found in medieval manuscripts. I'll try and show you an example. This is a hymn that I was singing last Sunday because we had a forefeast at the end of Vespers for the Holy Hypsimian Virgins. And this is the very hymn that was cited by Tntesean in his exposition on the putative metrical durations associated with the neumes. And here, so this is in the new Armenian notation, which is not pneumatic. The first three stanzas of the hymn, that little line means that you omit that note because there's a syllable of text missing. So he's written it in this way so that he doesn't have to write the three stanzas on their own, each with its own music. And in the case of the last line of the first stanza, here, on Mar, we have 4 beats, even though Mar has just a sheshet, is a single beat, according to his own hypothesis. For the other stanzas, we have yevorot, we have more syllables. So he has tried to keep the melody the same. Nothing could have prevented him from putting a horizontal line there and there, in which case those notes could have been omitted. He could have ensured that the melody would be of 1 beat's duration over that syllable, but he does not. Why is there this inconsistency? My first step was to examine the main printed sources, the Editio Princeps of Amsterdam, 1665, that you can see on the left, the very, very meticulous edition edited by Archbishop Utidjian, published in Venice in 1898 on the right. Jerusalem, 1936 is here. And the numations found in the hymnals that he had available to him would likewise have been like that. So this is an early manuscript. This is a very authoritative royal manuscript. It's the King Hetum II Hymnal Codex, at the latest dating from 1305, kept in Venice in San Lazzaro. Again, we have that neum, which is of a single beat's duration. The minutes of the Patriarchal Musical Committee don't cover this hymn, and apparently he wishes to achieve uniformity of the melody across successive stanzas, apparently at any cost. This is what I thought. But I was always niggled by the idea that the hymnal melody that we have, which has reached us under the name of the Tntesean, because he was imprisoned at the age of 47 and he died in the prison hospital and his work was unfinished, the manuscript draft may perhaps not have represented his views, and he would have devised a different melody if he had lived to do so. Who knows? But actually, when I was on my plane yesterday, I suddenly had this idea, being bored in my seat. I thought I should consult one other source on my iPad, and that is the volume created by Tntesean, a numated volume, which he published in 1877. It's called Exercises for Vocally Endowed Children, where he has included some celebrated hymns suitable to teach young people those melodies, and he has modified the numations for simplicity and consistency. And lo and behold, here on the right-hand side, Maer Sion, here it is, he has put 2 long neumes which justify the 4 beats, in order that the same melody be sung in the subsequent stanzas as well in the analogous position. And so we know it wasn't carelessness or anything like that. He deliberately and consciously changed the numations. And this, after all, tallies with his published criticism of Pietro Bianchini's transcription of the hymn Chorut Chorim in the Venetian tradition. He is concerned about the degree of complication, and pedagogically, it is much simpler to impose a uniform melody. And another complication must have been that we are unable to understand the neumes, to read them and correctly interpret their meaning. And so when in the manuscript, different stanzas have certain neumes placed in a different order, we know that they probably sang something a little differently, but we don't know how. I've omitted many interesting theoretical observations by Tntesean. There are many aspects. I would refer you to my paper at the Revue des Études Arméniennes of 2019. It was actually published more recently, but there's the date of 2018 to 19. And my monograph on Tntesean and the music of the Armenian Hymnal. His work includes some very subtle and nuanced observations about the relationship between Armenian modes and classical Ottoman makams. And it's interesting to study his different versions of the scales of what he refers to as the Eastern scale as opposed to the Western. Eastern embraces Ottoman, Armenian, and perhaps other traditions. My good friend and colleague Jacob Olley is a specialist in this sort of thing. And I should like finally to say something about reception, because I'm not going to include anything about reception in the Chicago volume because there's no space, but it's important. Now, there were rivalries, resentments, deceit, accusations of plagiarism, open letters to the press, which must have been very disagreeable at the time, but they're very fortunate from our point of view, because they force people to make explicit their standpoint, and they are, in effect, theoretical manifestos. A lot of this was with his arch-rival Nikolaos Tashyan. If we read between the lines, we can see that even though there was rivalry and personal antagonism, there were some fundamental reasons for tension as well. Tashyan was a musician and teacher and a sort of guardian of the tradition. Tntesean was all these things as well, but in addition, he was a theorist, a musicologist. And in the case of Tntesean, he was guided not merely to the instinctive adherence to oral melodies and procedures handed down orally from one generation, from teacher to pupil, but rather Tntesean was more prepared to be critical and to say, we have to go back to the neumes, to the notation, and see what we can conclude from those. And some of his contemporaries were instinctively against this. Of course, much of the opposition was not against Tntesean's theories per se, but to the very notion of interpreting the neumes, robbing church singers of their liberty to make things up as they go along, so to speak, whilst looking at the neumes in real time, and give fixity to the melodies and force people to sing that same melody. In the patriarchal committee meetings, we find Tntesean always being very well prepared, making theoretical presentations which had to be accepted by those present. Of course, his imprisonment meant that his influence was reduced, because even his own family were eager to destroy his publications, lest they be caught with one of them and be condemned to the same fate. And then there followed Sovietization in Armenia. Even Komitas, who knew that the Tntesean hymnal existed, was unable to access it. He considered it to be lost because it was kept under lock and key by his son, who was able to publish it only in 1934, 100 years after the birth of his late father. But it seems to me that Tntesean's triumph may lie in the manner in which other redactors, transcribers in Constantinople, but also further afield in places like Venice, Jerusalem, and Antilias, seem to have emulated his procedures, facing the same challenges and dilemmas, dealing with them in parallel ways, which display a certain affinity to his own. Though these other redactors and musicians do not make their procedures explicit, nonetheless, my detailed comparisons have demonstrated that they proceeded in much the same spirit as Tntesean. Could it be that Tntesean and his theories left a profound and fundamental influence, or is it simply that his views happened to be held by others independently and he merely codified them? Even if the latter were to be the case, and it's an open question, he remains uniquely valuable for articulating his procedures, doing so in a rational way and with great clarity. An interesting thing about Tntesean is the fundamental innermost tension between Tntesean, the theorist, and Tntesean, the musician. He argues explicitly at a session of the Patriarchal Musical Committee on the 10th of August, 1873. I've made an English translation from the publication of my friend Aram Kerovpian, in which he says, in comparing the melismata in question within the musical melodies, increasingly their surrounding notes need to be taken into consideration. This is an instance where he is explicitly crying out for the overall musical context to be borne in mind. There's a fascinating interplay here between theory and performance. Theory sometimes derived from empirical observations of performance practice, at other times intended to influence performing practice, or even to influence the formation of the melodies to be performed. Yet on other occasions, theory to be jettisoned in favor of other criteria, as we saw. There is one other fundamental difficulty that was faced by Tntesean and others in trying to construct and transcribe melodies, or working out realizations, you might say. They had to grapple with complications of intonational nuances, which again brings us to the Eastern versus Western scales, arguments and discussions for which there was no time today, but also, very importantly, to sacrifice some of the rhythmic freedom. Church musicians, as we know from early recordings, often sang melismatic pieces in a way that sounds as if it is being improvised, that it is giving vent to the inspiration of the moment. That kind of thing is very difficult to notate precisely. And if you do notate it precisely, you kill it, because someone else who uses that notation to reproduce the melody inevitably does so in a way that robs it of its freshness and improvised quality, its freedom. And this reminds us of Bianchini's own instructions to his musicians in Venice about how the music ought to be sung with a particular sort of freedom appropriate to the style for its effect to be sublime and celestial. And my friend and colleague Mark Hanna has done interesting work in the domain of Coptic sacred music, where he has demonstrated a law of diminishing returns. The more precisely, intricately you try to notate something with all its ornaments and things like that that are almost timeless or outside time, the more difficult it is to reproduce it properly. So it's quite counterproductive. We get a similar impression in the Venetian context if we listen to recordings made by Dayan himself or the late Father Verstanescu in San Lazzaro in Venice, with Dayan's own transcriptions. All this, and much more besides, flows out of Tntesean's theoretical endeavors, and we would have been much the poorer without his writings, redactions, and transcriptions. I should like to thank Carmen, Jacob, Melanie, and the Max Planck Institute, and all the organizations and persons who have helped me in my research. This concludes my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Haig, for a fantastic talk. Very rich as usual, full of detail, but very, very clear too. So we agreed beforehand that I would say something briefly in response. So I'll just share a couple of general thoughts, questions, possible avenues for further discussion, particularly in the context of this particular project. So perhaps first, just to say a couple of words for people who aren't familiar with Haig's work or with this field more generally, about why this sort of work, why Haig's work in particular is so important, and why Tntesean is important too. So partly that has to do with the legacy of Domitas Vartabet, who you mentioned briefly, and who is so sort of central to the historiography of Armenian music. And I think that sort of, so if he's the sort of representative figure for the history of Armenian music, for the question of the interpretation of the neumes and so on, partly that has to do with the fact that Komitas had some things published, certainly in German. He also gave talks in French in Europe, so he had a sort of certain amount of circulation and reception in Europe and European languages, which Tntesean, as far as I know, didn't have those kind of avenues to disseminate his research. As far as I know, he only published in Armenian. So part of Haig's work is, part of what is important about it is sort of excavating this far richer and deeper history of discussion and theorization about the neumes and how they might be interpreted, how they relate to the longer, deeper history of Armenian music. And Tntesean is a central figure in that, and a very sort of prolific, systematic, sophisticated thinker who should be generally more widely known. So part of the sort of historiographical context for this too has to do with a sort of question of the social context and the sort of political context, although Haig said we shouldn't talk about politics, but I am going to just briefly mention that. So, so I think this is sort of a good example for this, for the anthology too, of which I think the anthology tries to do in various ways, which is thinking about how do we think about theoretical debate, music theory, beyond sort of strictly defined, bounded national cultures or national traditions that are defined either linguistically or ethnically. So the question of the interpretation of the Armenian hymns and the sort of historiography of that, and Tntesean's contributions to that, is very difficult to understand without reference to Greek, Byzantine tradition, to the Ottoman musical tradition within Istanbul, and of course to things that were happening in Europe during the 19th century. So perhaps to put that as a question to that we could come back to, which is to what degree was Tntesean aware of contemporary debates or publications in Europe related to, for example, the tradition of neumes within the Latin Church, or musicological or musical theoretical debates within Europe in general. So that's something which I'll be curious to know about. So the question of theory to Tntesean kind of brings up very starkly this conceptual division that exists between practice and theory. And we've talked quite a bit within the project about the sort of problem of oral traditions that lack a sort of systematic written theory. That was something that kind of came up in Paris and how we might approach those traditions. But in this case, in the Armenian case, a slightly different problem, which is that you have quite a rich body of material, written material, and what is clearly a very sophisticated way of representing music in writing, that is very difficult to connect to a musical practice. So in a way, you have the sort of traces of a theoretical system, which is whose relation to practice is quite sort of contentious and debatable. And Tntesean kind of shows how these sort of materials, tools of theory, things like notation, could be sort of reconstructed and used for particular purposes. So in that respect, we have to sort of remember that musical traditions or musical theoretical traditions are not sort of fixed, stable things, but they're things that are constantly kind of reinvented and disrupted for for various reasons. And that's sort of very starkly shown in the Armenian case, but I think is valid for lots of other cases too. Just the third thing that I'd like to touch on, and perhaps to put that in a form of a question to. So Tntesean's sort of contribution as a theorist, Haig mentioned, has to do with his ability to describe what he is doing, to describe his kind of hermeneutic process, his method. So, but there is, of course, the possibility, which I think you hinted at, that this sort of type of process, a process of interpreting a notation, could be something that exists in practice too, although it isn't documented explicitly in writing. So the question is what makes a Tntesean a theorist the fact that he is able to describe what he is doing? I mean, is it in the description that he becomes a theorist? Lastly, I'm sort of curious about, so Tntesean's kind of personal biography, what was his background in terms of his musical training? I mean, how did he learn to sing within the church? And does this sort of differentiate him from someone like Utidjian, perhaps, in terms of Tntesean being slightly less associated with practical musical making and someone who's more interested in kind of building a sort of theoretical methodology? And does this have to do as well with the format in which these debates were happening? That is, especially the transition from manuscripts to printed sources and the sort of canonization of the hymnal into clearly legible printed sources using this modernized notation system. Could those sort of typographical constraints somehow have shaped Tntesean's theoretical decisions? So there's quite a lot of questions, but I just leave them there, and yeah, for you to respond, and then we can open up the discussion.
As initially agreed and promised, I will now stop the recording so that people will feel free to chip in, and we will all be able to say things without worrying about, I won't say without worrying about factual accuracy, but there are certain things which I could check, but I will now speak freely. So I shall end the recording now, if I may, even though, if I may say so, your extensive questions could provide fodder for about an hour's lecture very easily, and a further paper. So I'll switch off the recording.